Welcome to Sukhwant Hundal's podcast. In this episode, we present the 40 years long struggle of the Indo-Canadian community to gain the right to vote in Canada. The story is titled How Indians Lost and Finally Won Back the Right to Vote in Canada, written by Sukhwant Hundal and Sadhu Bining, and narrated by AI. Have a listen.
How Indians Lost and Finally Won Back the Right to Vote in Canada. Sukhwant Hundal, Sadhu Bining. Dedication Naginder Singh Gill, Darshan Singh Canadian, Dr. D.P. Pandya, who played a huge role in the long struggle to win the right to vote. There is a long history of many hard struggles waged by the Indian immigrants in Canada to win their rights as citizens of this country. While their activities to change the racist immigration laws and their efforts and sacrifices to aid the independence movement in India are well documented, little has been written or said about the struggle to gain back the right to vote here in Canada. Those who fought for 40 long years for this right thought that the day of victory would be written in golden letters in the history of the Indian community in Canada. They expressed their wish in a report published in 1947 by the Khalsa Diwan Society of Victoria. April 2nd will always remain a red-letter day in the history of our community as the day which brought us political freedom and equality with Canadian citizens under Dominion and provincial law. We would not be doing our duty if we didn't pay due respect to their wishes. It is extremely important for us to remember their efforts now that we have many elected politicians from our community in all levels of governments in Canada. Numerous people from our community contributed in different ways to this long battle. During this period, while racist white people, especially those in power, opposed the demand for franchise, at the same time there were individuals and organizations from the white community that supported the struggle. Many progressive people, including political parties like the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, which later became the NDP, and many workers' unions came on to the side of the Indian community. The support received from these sections of the larger society during the 1940s made a huge difference. Very little is written about this chapter of our history in Canada. The complete picture of the struggle is not clear from information that is currently available. We hope that this brief look at this ignored part of our past helps to shed some light and make the picture a bit clearer. In this paper, we will try to explore the various aspects of the franchise issue as faced by the Indian immigrants in Canada. We will discuss how and why their right to vote was taken away after their arrival in Canada by passing legislation in the Legislative Assembly in Victoria. What were the economic, political, or social causes that created fear among the people in power that they acted on the basis of race to stop the immigration from India or to keep those who did come here at the margin of the society? How did not having the right to vote negatively affect the daily lives of Indians in Canada? We will also explore the attitude of the British Empire and especially the British government in India and why they supported this demand even as they backed the racist policies of their dominions like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand to keep the non-white populations out of the countries and to keep those lands safe for the white people of Europe. Finally, we will discuss the different stages and aspects of the long struggle to win back the right to vote by the Indian community. We will also consider who sided with our community's struggle from the larger Canadian society and who opposed it. How was the right to vote taken away? Indians began immigrating to Canada's west coast to the province of British Columbia in the beginning of 20th century and started working as laborers in agriculture, fishing, and the lumber industries. The population of this province at the time was very small. The economy was not yet fully developed. The agriculture, fishing, and even to a certain extent the lumber industry were seasonal, and as a result, many people were not working for part of each year. The employers in the sawmills, farms, and in fish canneries, along with all levels of the government, to maintain their profits and control on the non-European workers, openly exploited them in more than one way. First, they would pay less to the Asians and make direct profit. Second, they used these workers as a lever to keep white workers at low wages and in poor working conditions. Third, whenever there was increased unemployment or any other social, political, or economic problem, they would use these Asian workers as scapegoats by laying the blame on them. In the late 19th and early 20th century, in order to divide the society into higher and lower classes, the European colonialists openly used their racist policies. Based on this view of race, they declared all non-white people as being a lower level of humans. They used this card to the point that of inciting violence against the Japanese and Chinese in Vancouver. Due to the pressure exerted by white workers to improve their working conditions and raise their wages, the colonial rulers stopped Japanese and Chinese immigration to a large extent. As a result, there was a drop in the available pool of workers in all three major industries of British Columbia. To fill this gap, Punjabi immigrants from India were allowed to enter. However, white workers opposed these new immigrants as well because the employers were using them as they had used the other Asian workers. The Indian immigrants faced all kinds of racism and hatred upon their arrival here. Their entry as immigrants and their status as British subjects, which placed them at an equal level as Europeans, were opposed. To satisfy the racist white population and to keep Canada a white man's country, a law was passed in 1908 against Indians entering Canada, called the Continuous Journey Regulation. This law required that in order to be eligible to enter in Canada, a person must come to Canada on a continuous journey from his or her country of birth. However, at that time it was impossible to do so from India because there was no direct passenger ship service between India and Canada. As a result, this law barred the entry of all Indians to Canada. The Indians challenged that law by bringing the Kamagata Maru here on a continuous journey from Hong Kong to Vancouver. At the same time, the right to be citizens of this country was taken away from Indians who were already here. Upon arrival, Indians had had the right to vote at all levels of the government because they were subjects of the British Empire. However, by changing the provincial electoral law in British Columbia in 1907, their right to vote in BC was taken away. Then in 1908, they were also stripped of their right to vote at the municipal level. Similarly, this right had already been taken away from the Chinese and Japanese in 1874 and 1895 respectively. Due to the change in the provincial electoral law, the Indians were also unable to vote at the federal level because at that time an individual could vote at the federal level only if he or she had that right at the provincial level. Even though they had the right to vote in other provinces, because the majority were living in BC at the time, the change in BC's law effectively made them unable to vote anywhere in Canada. In BC, racist ideology was used to justify snatching the right to vote from Indians. For example, on March 26, 1907, while presenting the bill to take the right to vote away from Indians, Interior Minister W.H. Bowser of the Conservative government said, "I regret exceedingly that the federal government has taken a very strong stand in regard to a legislation of this character. But I ask the Liberals of this House to break away from the party alliance in this and keep British Columbia a white man's country to the extent that is in power." When this right was being taken away, the opposition Liberal Party didn't oppose this move. In fact, they supported it in a light-hearted tone. The leader of the opposition, W. MacDonald, said while laughing, "I do not say what Mr. Bowser takes the right view of the question. I agree with keeping foreigners out of our voters list." He added, "A Hindu, though a British subject, not 1 in 100 among them can speak our language nor are they familiar with our laws and customs. I would suggest that the government revise our election laws, and while depriving those Hindus and naturalized foreigners of franchise, exclude also others who are unable to read even a ballot paper. Until such action is taken, I propose I vote for this measure." In a frivolous atmosphere, some other members also presented their views. One member said to Bowser, "If the Hindu were strong and mighty and had a navy of his own, the senior member of Vancouver, Mr. Bowser, would not introduce this measure." The members in attendance greeted this with laughter. The similar kind of racism was shown in 1923 in Canada's Parliament during the discussion about granting franchise rights to Indians. At this time, Mr. McBride, the elected MP from BC's Cariboo area, spoke against granting the right to vote to Indians as follows: "We in British Columbia want no more Hindus. Never did I value Canada and the laws of Canada more highly than when a boatload of Hindus came from India to the port of Vancouver and was refused admittance to this country and sent back home by the previous government. I hope this government will maintain that stand. We have on the coast of British Columbia Chinamen and Japs running our stores. They are running the white people out. We have the Greeks there running our hotels, and we have the Jews running our secondhand stores, and now some people want to bring in the Hindus to run our mills." The same year, in November 1923, the government of British Columbia passed a strong resolution against granting the right to vote back to Indians. The independent member Major R. J. Bird from Alberni presented the resolution. It was passed on December 27, 1923, in the Legislative Assembly of British Columbia. Its purpose was to warn the Dominion government that they should not take any steps to give the Oriental people the right to vote. Before it was presented in the Assembly, some parts of the resolution were published in the press. According to these press reports, the resolution stated, "Be it resolved that this legislature is strongly opposed on economic and social grounds to allowing any Oriental to vote in this province, either in provincial or Dominion elections, and therefore urges the federal government to take no steps that would interfere with the undoubted right of the province to prescribe the form and extent of its own franchise, and further urges the Government of Canada, when defining its Dominion franchise, not to enfranchise Orientals." When on December 27, 1923, the resolution was presented in the BC Assembly, not a single voice was raised against it. The Minister of Mines, Honourable William Sloane, said in support of this resolution, "So far as the franchise is concerned, we are mistress in our own house, and that we in British Columbia stand for a white province. It is clear from these examples that the racist ideology was used to keep the right to vote away from the Indian immigrants in BC and Canada. The main goal of this racist approach was to maintain the control of the economy and politics of Canada in the hands of the white people. The effects of not having the right to vote. There were several negative effects of not having the right to vote on the lives of Indian immigrants. The first was that in the absence of this right, they were not able to participate in the politics of Canada and had no say in electing the representatives of the three levels of governments: Dominion, province, and municipal. Also, they were not able to run as candidates in elections for these three levels of governments. As a result, they were not in a position to participate in any meaningful way in the legislations enacted by the three levels of governments and the laws that directly impacted their lives. Secondly, there were many restrictions on Indians as the result of not having the right to vote. For example, they were not allowed to sit on any jury. They were not allowed to work with the contractors of public works departments. They could not become lawyers, pharmacists, trustees of the school boards, and so on. In total, there were 26 such restrictions on Indians connected with not having the right to vote. Third, the Canadian government used this as an argument to deny people from India the right to immigrate to Canada. The Canadian Immigration Act didn't allow those people into the country who were not considered able to fulfill the duties of a citizen. Voices were raised to demand the right to vote immediately after it was taken away from the Indians. Along with the local Indian community, the British Empire and their Indian representatives also raised this demand. Both of these entities had different motives, though. On the one hand, the British government and their representatives were demanding the right to vote for the Indians in Canada because they were afraid that it would create anger amongst Indians in India against the colonial British government. On the other hand, the Indians living in Canada were demanding the right because they wanted to be equal to other citizens of Canada. Due to the difference in their motives, they had different approaches to the problem. We will explore the role played by each separately. The British Empire and its representatives' concerns about the right to vote of Indians living in Canada. In the history of India's independence movement, there are many examples of the mistreatment faced by Indians in other parts of the British Empire being used to incite rebellion against the British in India. One good example of this is that the freedom fighters used the Kamagata Maru incident to create anger against the British in India. In view of these types of activities, the British rulers and their representatives were afraid that denial of franchise to Indians in Canada could lead to anger against the British in India, or the Indian freedom fighters could utilize this mistreatment to further their cause. Thus, they were asking for franchise for Indians in Canada. A resolution passed at the Imperial Conference held on 10 Downing Street in London on June 20, 1921, articulated concern about Indians not having equal rights in other parts of the British Empire such as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, and from the perspective of British Commonwealth unity, it expressed the desire that Indians should have the right to be citizens of these countries. It is important to note that when this resolution was passed at the Imperial Conference in 1921, the members of the Babar Akali movement were engaged in an armed struggle against the English and their local administrators in the Doaba region of Punjab. The Ghadar experience not only inspired this movement, some of the Ghadar members were directly involved in this struggle. It clearly shows that the English government was worried about the growing unrest among the Indians. They were also worried that the mistreatment of Indians in other parts of the empire could increase its problems in India. To eliminate this fear, the British Indian government in 1922 sent V.S. Sri Niwas Shastri, member of the British Privy Council, to visit various parts of the empire. During his visit to Canada, Sri Niwas Shastri met with representatives of different levels of the government and had discussions about the problems confronted by the English government in India due to the discrimination faced by Indian immigrants. On August 19, 1922, in one such meeting in Victoria with BC Premier John Oliver, Mr. Shastri said to the Premier, "Hindus in British Columbia are British subjects just as much as most white people here and should have all the privileges of British citizenship, although they do reside in Canada." He also pointed out that the Hindus fought in the war and that therefore they should be accorded better treatment than they are now receiving. Mr. Shastri argued that Hindus should not only have the right to vote in Dominion and provincial elections, but they should also have the right to take part in mayoralty and other municipal elections and sit as aldermen on the city council if elected. In his response, Premier Oliver assured him that he and his cabinet would consider the proposal from the interests of the country. However, in reality, the BC government took no positive step in response to Shastri's suggestion. Actually, BC's Assembly passed a very strong resolution in opposition to giving Indians the right to vote, as has been discussed earlier. What Shastri and the British Indian government at the time demanded was simple and short. All they wanted was that Indians living legally in these countries should be given full citizenship rights due to their being British subjects. They were internally in agreement with the whites in these dominions to keep them safe for the whites only, and tried their best to reassure them. For example, while talking to the press, Mr. Shastri said, "By an agreement of 1908, no Indians are allowed to come to Canada for settlement. Now the Indian authorities cannot even seem to be attempting to break the word of that agreement by suggesting that the question be reopened. In our view, here Mr. Shastri is referring to the agreement or the law passed by the Indian government in 1918 and not in 1908. According to that law, no person from India can after 1918 migrate to any dominion for purposes either of labor or permanent settlement." The effect of Sri Niwas Shastri's visit to Canada was that the politicians at the Dominion, Canada level were forced to pay attention to the issue. As a result of Shastri's request and the resolution passed in London a year earlier, there was heated debate in Canada's Parliament on June 29, 1923. Liberal Party MP Mr. Jacobs raised the issue in the Parliament that according to the resolution passed by the Imperial Conference, the Indians, being British subjects, should be given the right to vote. He strongly opposed it and expressed his views in an extremely racist manner. The main opposition came from BC MPs Mr. Neil and Mr. McBride. Mr. Neil tried to end the topic by stating that the issue did not concern the central government of Canada. He said, "It is not a Dominion matter. It is a British Columbia problem. Let us settle this problem in British Columbia." The other BC MPs' views also contained explicit racism and anger. In reaction, CCF Party MP J. Woodsworth supported the extension of franchise to Indians and said, "I cannot see that we are going to get very far by a narrow bigotry of that kind. I believe that, in dealing with these matters difficult as they are, and I know they are difficult, we should rise above narrow prejudice and look at them from a little bit more of a world point of view." Similarly, in September 1928, 3 members from the British Empire's Parliament Association, Divan Bahadur G. A. Netson, Divan C. Lal and T.C. Goswami came to BC. They too expressed their views to the Canadian press supporting the right to vote for the Indians. In a meeting with BC Cabinet, they only asked whether Indians were allowed the right to vote here or not. When they were informed that the Indians did not have the right to vote, they did not mention the issue after that. In August of 1932, a British delegation came on a visit to Canada. The head of this delegation, Sir Atul Chatterjee, appeared before the Canadian cabinet and raised the issue that the Indians should be given the right to vote. The representatives of the Canadian government assured him that they would consider the matter. Whenever the British government envoys met with BC and Canada's leaders, an appeal was made that they should grant Indians the right to vote. However, they never questioned the racism and racist policies of these governments. In fact, they spoke the language of the white rulers. They stayed in their hotels and spoke from their forums of privilege such as Lions Club and the like. It was clear that they did not worry about the mistreatment of Indians in these foreign lands. Rather, their worry was the reaction these conditions created in India among the masses. So, in order to keep Indians under control, the white government was forced to raise the issue of the rights of Indians living in these colonies. It cannot be denied that the representatives of the British Indian government had an influence on other governments, and as they raised this issue it became more important than it would have been otherwise. Indian community in Canada understood this quite well. For this reason, it would sometime invite these envoys themselves to come and speak and pay for their visits and so on. The struggle by the local Indian community. At different stages of this 40 years long struggle to gain the right to vote in Canada, 1907 to 1947, the local Indian community used a variety of strategies and arguments in support of its case. These strategies and reasons were dependent upon the different situations of each stage and time. At every turn of the struggle, the community had to face failures repeatedly. However, they did not stop fighting until success was achieved. If we keep this fact in mind that according to different reports between 1942 to 1947, when the fight to gain the right to vote was at its peak, the total population of Indians in Canada was between 1,200 to 1,700, then the significance of this struggle becomes more important. During this long struggle, the Indians in Canada on one hand sought the support of white people who had lived in India and were loyal to British Empire, and on the other hand from the people belonging to the labor movement in Canada, especially in BC, and people committed to socialist ideas. The members of the Indian community in Canada met with political leaders of BC and submitted their petitions, but they did not hesitate to challenge these political leaders if there was a need for it. The first step of the struggle to gain the right to vote by Indians was taken by Hussein Rahim. According to a report in the Aryan, a newspaper published by the Indians in Canada, Hussein Rahim voted in the municipal election of Vancouver in 1911. He contended that being a British subject, he had the right to vote in this election. However, in the eyes of local laws, it was illegal. As a result, he was put on trial. However, he was acquitted in this trial. With this action of Hussein Rahim, the issue of right to vote for Indians in Canada came to the forefront. After 1920, this issue came to life again and remained active until 1947 in one form or other. Local Indian community members presented a number of arguments in order to gain the right to vote. First of all, they argued that they were British subjects and therefore they should have the right to vote. During their struggle, they repeatedly used this argument. For example, in April 1927, Canada's Governor-General Viscount Willingdon came to Vancouver. At this time, an 8-member delegation from the Indian community met with the Governor-General and handed him a petition. The petition demanded that because Indians living in Canada were British subjects, therefore they should be granted citizenship rights. The second argument made by Indians to gain the right to vote in Canada was that the Indians had shed blood for the British Empire. This was said in the petition given to the Governor-General of Canada in 1927. After that, most of the time when delegations of Indians met with the representatives of the BC government, the Indian soldiers who had served the British Empire were included in these delegations. For example, on March 2, 1943, the delegation that met BC Premier John Hart in regard to the right to vote included 3 soldiers. One of them was Bahu Singh, who had fought in the First World War. The other 2, Fangon Singh and G.S. Badal, were part of the Canadian Army at that time. The white sympathizers of the Indian community who had lived in India used to make this argument strongly. On August 28, 1942, Sir Robert Holland said this in a meeting. It was unfair that Indians who were prepared to fight side by side with Canadian soldiers and were destined to spend their entire lives in this country should be denied the right to a voice in Canada's affairs. Actually, Indian people were very angry that they were not treated equally in the empire for which they were willing to sacrifice their lives. At the time of the Second World War, this anger was at its peak, when young people from the local Indian community started to receive letters for forced military service in Canada. The community felt that when the Canadian government was not willing to enfranchise them, then the government had no right to force their youth to serve in the military. In October 1942, the Khalsa Diwan Society registered a strong protest in front of the Defence Ministry of Canada. By understanding the reality of those times, the Indian community, while continuing to protest, also decided to exploit the issue of forced military service to its advantage. In 1942, the Khalsa Diwan Society sent a petition to the Canadian government in which they argued that Indian people were loyal to Canada and, if necessary, were willing to sacrifice their lives for the country. However, they felt that if they were being asked to perform the duties of the British subjects, then they should be given the rights of British subjects. A large section of the mainstream community supported the argument of the Indian community. For example, two newspapers of Vancouver, the Vancouver News Herald and the Vancouver Daily Province, wrote favorable editorials on the basis of this argument. On October 13, 1942, the editorial of the Vancouver Daily Province stated as follows: "The East Indians have some very good arguments. They are British subjects, they point out. They say they are loyal, and in the absence of the slightest evidence to the contrary, it must be assumed they are. They insist that they would be happy to serve Canada in any way possible if admitted to citizenship. Some of them, though without citizenship rights, are subject to the draft, and they regard that as hardly fair. East Indians have been seeking the franchise in this province since 1908. If it is ever to be granted, now, while it can be employed to great political advantage, is the right moment." Another issue used by the Indian community to gain the right to vote was the political instability in India due to the freedom struggle. For example, in 1942-43, the Quit India agitation was very strong in India. Therefore, in a petition in 1942, the Indian community argued that the granting of franchise to Indians in Canada would be helpful to calm the political turmoil in India. The Indian community also used to remind Canadian authorities on a regular basis that the community had made significant contributions to the development of Canada. They said that Indian people were living in Canada as good citizens. They paid taxes and were contributing to the economic development of Canada. For example, in their petition to Governor-General Viscount on April 9, 1927, they wrote that many of the 1100s above mentioned have resided in Canada for from 20 to 25 years, during which time they have purchased, improved and developed considerable land and built up many important and flourishing industries, paid large amounts in taxes and otherwise carried on as good and industrious citizens of their adopted country. In 1940s, the same argument was articulated on various occasions. For example, on March 2, 1943, a delegation of Indians and their sympathizers met the Premier John Hart of British Columbia. The members of this delegation were Naginder Singh Gill, Secretary of the Khalsa Diwan Society Vancouver; Naranjan Singh, President of the Khalsa Diwan Society Vancouver; Darshan Singh Sangha, who later became popular in Punjab's political scene as Darshan Singh Canadian; Hazara Singh Garcha; Harnam Singh, President of the Khalsa Diwan Society Victoria; Didar Singh, Treasurer of the Khalsa Diwan Society; Aryan Singh, Vice Treasurer of the Khalsa Diwan Society; Mohinder Singh, Fangan Singh, G.S. Badal, Bahu Singh; Sir Robert Holland and Harold Pritchett, the President of the International Woodworkers of America's District No. 1. During the meeting with the Premier, the Secretary of Khalsa Diwan Society Vancouver, Naginder Singh Gill, read from the brief, "We have tried conscientiously to fulfill the duties and responsibilities of citizenship, but we have been denied the democratic rights of that citizenship. We contend that the denial of these rights is without justification in logic or reason. We are a people of an old and democratic tradition. We believe in and are prepared to fight for principles and liberties of democracy. We want our children to grow up as good Canadians and responsible citizens." Similarly, on September 16, 1947, at Harrison Hot Springs, at a meeting of the Union of Municipal Ties, while advocating for the right to vote for Indians, Indian lawyer Dr. D.P. Pandya said that Indian people were taxpayers and property owners, and that it was a fundamental principle of democracy that there should be no taxation without representation. Indians had been pioneers in the economic development of Canada, particularly in the lumber industry and agriculture. They were loyal people who had given $500,000 towards the 6th Victory Bond issue and contributed generously to the Red Cross and hospitals. While the representatives of the British government of India would only ask for the right of citizenship for Indians living in Canada, the local Indian community would demand for opening up of more immigration for Indians along with asking for the right to vote. For example, in the petition of April 9, 1927 to Governor-General Viscount Willingdon, the Indian community had demanded that the Canadian government should allow some Indians to come to Canada every year and lessen the restrictions placed on entry of Indian students and traders into Canada. During this long and difficult struggle to gain the right to vote, the Indian community developed connections with friends and sympathizers outside of the community and obtained their support. The people from the mainstream community who supported the struggle belonged to socialist organizations, the trade union movement, the CCF Party, the Labor Progressive Party, churches, teachers' associations, etc. In addition, many prominent Canadians of that time also helped the Indian community in this regard. After going on for many years, the struggle reached its peak between 1942 to 1947. We would like to discuss in detail the support that the Indian community gained from the CCF and the trade union movement during this period because, in our view, this support played a decisive role in the success of this struggle. The representatives of the CCF Party presented this issue in the BC legislature and spoke in its favor. In a report in 1947, Harnam Singh and Sundar Singh, President and Secretary of the Khalsa Diwan Society Victoria, wrote about the significance of this support as follows. Although we continued to agitate for revision of the franchise law in our favor, it never again became a live issue until the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, a socialist party, adopted it as one of the main issues in their program to remove racial discrimination. On March 9, 1944, W. Leafex, the CCF's assembly member from Vancouver East, introduced an amendment to BC's Election Act to grant the right to vote to Indians. Mrs. Laura Jameson, CCF's assembly member from Vancouver Centre, spoke in support of this amendment. However, this amendment did not pass because the Speaker of the Legislature, Mr. Whitaker, declared the bill containing this amendment out of order due to some technical reasons. After this, CCF party members continued to speak in favor of granting this right to Indians living in Canada. On October 23, 1944, the leader of the CCF, Harold E. Winch, came to the Sikh temple in Vancouver and said, "The CCF's policy is for granting the rights of citizenship to all people legally resident in Canada, irrespective of racial origin." A year later, in a session of the BC legislature on March 15, 1945, MLA from Vancouver Centre, W. Leafex, again introduced a bill to amend the BC Election Act to grant the right to vote to Indians. While introducing the bill, he said, "With thousands of Indian troops dying for democracy in the jungles of Burma, it is high time the Hindus here are given citizenship rights. By refusing them the vote, BC is encouraging substandards of labor and creating a problem that will have to be faced sooner or later, like the Negro problem in the US." Even though there was widespread support in BC for the enfranchisement of Indians, this amendment failed to pass in the legislature. On March 28, 1945, the bill was defeated by 4 votes, 18 in favor and 22 against. In a letter published in the Victoria Daily Times of April 7, 1945, Darshan Singh Sangha commented on this defeat as follows: "East Indians are British subjects by birth. They are subject to all taxation and other duties that full-fledged citizen is required to perform. It is beyond reason why British citizens should not have full citizenship rights inside a British dominion." Why was this bill defeated at this time when there was a favorable environment in support of granting a franchise to Indians in BC? Because the Liberal government of BC at that time was not willing to grant this right to Indians. Therefore, it is worthwhile to briefly examine the attitude of the BC's Liberals in regard to this issue. On March 9, 1944, in a debate on the amendment to the BC Election Act, introduced by the CCF MLA W. Leafex, the Provincial Secretary and the Minister of Labour, Honourable George Pearson, while opposing the amendment, commented as follows: "There should be more than nationality in order to allow persons to enjoy the franchise. The Hindu is not helping us to maintain the standard of living we have set up in the province. There is nobody in this province as unreliable, dishonest, and deceitful as the Hindus. We cannot get information from them. They break every regulation we have. We know of cases where Hindus had to pay other Hindus to get jobs. Chinese are the worry of our lives in the Labor Department, and Japanese were also. We are justified in excluding them from the full rights of citizenship." The statement of Mr. Pearson produced a wave of anger among the Indian community and its supporters. Laura Jameson, CCF MLA from Vancouver Centre, took notice of the minister's statement and said that a reflection of color prejudice was visible from this statement. The Indian community reacted strongly against this statement. Naginder Singh Gill, the secretary of the Khalsa Diwan Society Vancouver, said, "Mr. Pearson's charges are unprovoked and unjustified. And when Mr. Pearson includes the Chinese people of BC in his sweeping condemnation, he assumes a chauvinistic attitude characteristic of the Nazi theories of the master race. Naginder Singh Gill challenged Mr. Pearson to repeat his words outside the legislature and said, "If Mr. Pearson is an honorable gentleman, he will publicly apologize for his untrue words. But if he is unwilling to do so, let him repeat them outside of the walls of the legislature. We can assure him if he does, we shall immediately take slander proceedings to permit the courts to decide whether or not we are the kind of undesirable citizens, scorned and insulted so gratuitously by Mr. Pearson, hiding behind his parliamentary privilege." On March 14, 1944, a delegation from the Indian community met Labour Minister Pearson to express a formal protest about his statement. The members of this delegation were Naginder Singh Gill, Secretary of the Khalsa Diwan Society, Vancouver; Jerry Singh Hundal, Mohinder Singh, a representative of the Khalsa Diwan Society, Victoria; and Darshan Singh Sangha. This delegation presented the Labour Minister Pearson with the protest letter and demanded that he should retract his words. The delegation also brought with them a letter from the Chinese Youth Association of Victoria, which on behalf of the Chinese community expressed a resentment against Labour Minister Pearson's words. On March 22, 1944, Labour Minister Pearson sent a letter of apology to the Khalsa Diwan Society. That letter did not satisfy the Indian community. However, Mr. Pearson did not utter those words outside the assembly. Therefore, it never came to the point where Indian community would have to sue him for libel. The Indian community's struggle to gain the right to vote continued, and the Liberal government of BC continued to find new excuses to deny them this right. In December 1944, when the Indian community was preparing to get this question raised again in the next year's assembly session, a delegation from the community met with BC's Attorney General, R.L. Maitland. After meeting with the delegation, Attorney General Maitland issued the following statement. The Oriental vote question is one which has been accepted and settled in this province for 50 years. The East Indians are advancing an argument differing somewhat from those of the past. I do not think, however, when we have 50,000 of our best people away fighting in the war, that this is the time to consider any change about which they could not be consulted. They are the ones who will have to carry on tomorrow, and they should be permitted to give consideration to any change in major politics or doctrines applying in this country. The Attorney General's excuse shocked and hurt the Indian community. A spokesperson from the community reacted by saying that this statement by the Attorney General was an insult to the courageous performance of our people in the war. The Indians thought that the Attorney General's statement was against democratic values. In a letter published in the Victoria Daily Times, Darshan Singh Sangha commented as follows. Mr. Maitland contends that the boys overseas may disapprove East Indian enfranchisement at this time. Those boys are giving their lives to extend the same freedom to the people of Europe, which the East Indians are demanding at home. Freedom, like charity, begins at home. Canadian democracy will not suffer but will gain with extension of democratic rights to a people who, too, are a part of the Commonwealth. The Indian community also believed that at that time a majority of Canadian soldiers and the general public was in favor of their enfranchisement. The evidence for their belief can be seen from the following letter of J.E. Boyd published in Vancouver News Herald. In this letter, J.E. Boyd expressed his views as follows. Before leaving for Europe, my son's last words were, "Never mind, Dad. I am fighting in a war that means something. I can only hope, with other parents whose boys are fighting and dying on every battlefield to wipe out the racial hate of fascism, that they will not hear of Attorney General R.L. Maitland's curt refusal to even consider the question of votes for the East Indians. Our armed forces have been told they are fighting for the four freedoms. Would it not greatly weaken their morale to learn that a representative of the Crown repudiates their sacrifices? Racial hate is the poisoned soul of fascism, without which fascism's goal cannot be attained, and it is our duty to uproot the venomous Nazi-like fangs polluting the bloodstream of national unity. In consideration of their excellent record in the building of BC and support of the war effort despite the serious handicaps of unequal opportunities, the East Indians decidedly merit the right of franchise or now. Let us extend them a friendly helping hand. In order to understand the extent of support for the Indian franchise in the larger community, we need to examine the contribution made by the trade union movement of the time. It is true that in the first 2 or 3 decades of the 20th century, Canadian and British Columbian workers were not in favor of Indians' immigration to Canada. However, the situation had changed in the 1940s. In this decade, BC's labor movement strongly supported the Indian struggle to gain the right to vote. It is important to note here that up to this time, this contribution of BC's labor movement has not been given due credit in the recorded history of this struggle. For example, not a single word is mentioned in the aforementioned report of the Khalsa Diwan Society of Victoria about this contribution of the labor movement and its representatives. Harold Pritchett, the president of the District No. 1 of the International Woodworkers of America, was fully involved in this struggle. He was a member of various delegations from the Indian community who met with the government of BC in regard to the right to vote. In March 1944, when BC's Labour Minister made the above-mentioned negative comments about Indians, the IWA condemned those remarks and demanded that the minister should retract them. Later on, in November 1944, IWA President Harold Pritchett visited the Sikh Temple of Vancouver and assured the Indian community that the East Indian people have the backing of the entire labor movement in their struggle for the franchise. Besides the IWA, the majority of other unions in BC were in favor of franchise for Indians. As mentioned earlier, in March 1945, a bill was introduced in the legislature of BC to grant voting rights to Indians. If we look at BC's newspapers of the few weeks prior to March 1945, we find that almost every week there was some kind of statement issued or resolution passed by one of the unions in BC in favor of Indians' voting rights. At this time, the following unions expressed their support for this cause: IWA, the Dock and Shipyard Workers Union, Civic Employees Union, National Union of Operating Engineers Local No. 3, the United Oil Workers Union Local No. 1, IWA Mission Local, United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners, AFL, Local 452, Mine Mill and Smelters Workers, Local 693, National Union of Machinists Union Vancouver, Pile Drivers Union Local 2404, and others. There were many reasons behind the BC labor movement's support for Indians' right to vote at this time in contrast to earlier times. First, due to the Second World War, the economy of BC was doing very well. Therefore, BC's white workers did not consider Indian workers a threat to their jobs. Secondly, under the influence of the international labor movement, a sense of camaraderie had developed among the workers of different nationalities. Thirdly, more than 4 decades has passed since Indians began living in Canada, and during this time they were successful in developing relations with BC's white European decent settlers. Fourthly, under the leadership of Vancouver's Khalsa Diwan Society's Secretary Naginder Singh Gill, the Indian community took a conscious decision that they were going to gain support of the majority community and the trade union movement of British Columbia. Fifthly, the Indian community was successful in gaining the support of the labor movement of BC because Darshan Singh Sangha was actively working as an organizer for the IWA in BC. Even though there was such big support for the Indians in the larger community, the government of BC was still not willing to grant this right to them. However, as a result of this support, in 1945 the bill that was introduced to grant the right to vote to Indians was defeated by only 4 votes, and some of the Liberal MLAs voted in favor of the bill. With the defeat of the bill in 1945, the Indian community was hurt, but they did not lose heart. They resumed working on the issue right away in order to achieve victory in the next session of the Assembly. The next election for the BC legislature was to be held in December 1945. In October 1945, the Khalsa Diwan Society of Vancouver sent a circular to every candidate who was going to take part in this election. The circular stated, "With the victorious conclusion of the war against Hitler fascism and Japanese aggression, we feel that democratic rights should be extended to all Canadian residents who are British subjects and of East Indian origin, on a basis of full equality with all others. Many of our kinsmen died fighting in the recent war for these principles." A Liberal-Conservative coalition won the BC's election in December 1945. Soon after the election, during the first session of the Assembly, an all-party committee was formed to review BC Selections Act. During the process of its public hearings, the committee came to Vancouver on October 31, 1946. On November 1, 1946, a delegation appeared before this committee on behalf of the Indian community. The members of this delegation were Kapoor Singh, Kirtar Singh, Mayo Singh, Aishar Singh, Gurdit Singh, Naginder Singh, and Dr. Pandya. On behalf of this delegation, Dr. Pandya presented a brief to this committee. The Vancouver News Herald published an editorial in support of extending voting rights to Indians on November 1, 1946. In Vancouver, 12 organizations presented their briefs to this committee and supported the granting of franchise to the Indians. There was only one organization which opposed the right to vote for Indians. In response to such support, the All-Party Committee of the BC Legislature on November 7, 1946 recommended that voting rights should be granted to Indians, Japanese, and Chinese people living in British Columbia. As a result, BC's legislature passed the Bill 85, which gave the right to vote to Indian, Japanese, and Chinese Canadian in BC. The achievement of the right to vote in BC automatically made Indians eligible to vote in the Dominion of Canada's elections. However, Indians still had no right to vote in the municipal elections. Except in Vancouver, voting in all municipalities in BC was governed by the Municipal Elections Act. In order to amend this act, a resolution had to be presented and passed in the annual convention of BC municipalities. However, Vancouver had its own charter to govern its municipal elections. This charter had to be changed in Vancouver. The achievement of voting rights at the BC level had opened a window of opportunity to get voting rights at the municipal level. On September 10, 1947, a delegation of Indians under the leadership of the Indian Progressive Society appeared before the Vancouver City Council and petitioned for the right to vote at the municipal level. Some of the key members of this delegation were Sukhwant Singh, President of Indian Progressive Society; Naginder Singh Gill and Elmore Philpott, columnist at the Vancouver Sun. However, Vancouver City Council did not make any decision concerning their request. Perhaps, before making its decision, the Vancouver City Council wanted to wait for the decision of the municipalities of BC on this matter. On September 16, 1947, the annual convention of BC municipalities took place in Harrison Hot Springs. Dr. Pandya spoke at this convention to convince its delegates to vote in favor of voting rights for the Indians at the municipal level. This convention passed a resolution to grant the right to vote to Indians. This resolution was applicable in all the municipalities of BC except Vancouver. On October 23, 1947, the Legislative Committee of Vancouver City Council held its meeting. Dr. Pandya, Kapoor Singh, Kirtar Singh, and Aishar Singh attended the meeting on behalf of the Indian community. The committee amended its election rules and granted voting rights to Indians in Vancouver. This concluded the 40 years long struggle of Indians to gain the right to vote in Canada. Conclusion: the place and the recognition Indian immigrants and their descendants have achieved in the Canadian society has been possible due to the long struggle waged to gain the right to vote. This is quite obvious in the political field. If we had not won the right to vote when we did, we would not have been this effective in the political process. The people who wanted to keep Canada just for the whites knew quite well that they would not be able to stop non-whites from being successful if given the right to participate in the Canadian political system. This fear is very clearly expressed in an editorial of the Vancouver Sun, written in 1944. 8% of our population in this province is Oriental. If they had votes, it is quite possible they could elect 3 representatives to the legislature, a Chinese, a Japanese, and a Hindu. The honorable member from Powell Street is not quite a myth. Many other rights were also connected with the franchise. Our people who were barred from voting also did not have the right to hold jobs in many important sectors of the economy and the civil administration. They could only work in some marginal sectors. It was due to the absence of this right that non-whites were not able to find better jobs even after getting higher education. One grave effect of this situation was that while there were ample opportunities, the Indians born here in the earlier decades of last century were not able to get a higher education. The damage it did to the community as a whole can never be recovered. In other words, if the franchise had not been taken away from our community or if it had been granted earlier, it would have changed the community for the better. It is for such reasons that this victory was so important that it completely changed the direction of our community. During the long struggle for the right to vote, Indians took some significant steps to make themselves a permanent part of the Canadian society. In this process, they tried to understand how the Canadian political system worked, which should be considered an important achievement in itself. At the same time, they increased contact with the larger society at the organizational level. Many activities during the right to vote struggle bear witness to how Indians forged strong relations with other organizations, political parties, and labor organizations. These relations are giving strength to the community even now. It should be noted that a specific sector of the larger society has been more responsive than others. These were people with progressive ideas who wanted to make Canada a country based on equality where, regardless of one's color, race, religion, or any other difference, one would get the same respect as everyone else. Perhaps the most significant aspect of the victory for the right to vote struggle was that through it the Indian immigrants became one of the forces that made Canada the country it is today. In 1947, Vancouver Sun journalist Elmore Philpott's words bear witness to this. As a Canadian of European ancestry, I can testify to and stress the fact that this was a victory by Indians for Indians, but in larger sense by Indians in Canada for human equality everywhere. By winning the right to vote, this struggle not only made the Indians respectable in the eyes of the larger community, it gave Canada a special place in the world. If the Canadian society is considered one of the best societies in the world, undoubtedly, the Indians contributed to this image by continuously struggling to change those discriminatory laws that divided people based on their color, race, religion, and other differences. Acknowledgement. We sincerely appreciate and are thankful to our longtime friend David Jackson for his help in the English translation of this paper. To see the references for the sources of information used in this paper, please click the link provided in the description section to view the paper published online.